At 11 minutes before midnight on November 16th, 1974, Tuck Ramey saw a dead woman lift her hands toward the bell ropes in St. Orison's chapel. He had remained after Rhoda Pell's funeral to fold chairs, bank the coal stove, and latch the windows against the sleet. Her family had already followed the hearse down the mountain, and the undertaker's men had buried her above the laurel thicket. At 68, after 3 decades digging in stone-laced soil, Tuck regarded the dead as the least troublesome people in Mercy Gap, Tennessee. The bell ropes had been cut in 1952, and the clappers removed the next spring after the belfry cracked. 2 frayed lengths still ended 12 feet above the aisle. The clappers lay wrapped in altar linen inside a locked sacristy cupboard. Yet as he passed the last pew, he heard rope fibers tightening overhead. Rhoda Pell stood in the rear vestibule. She wore the gray dress in which she had been buried, the collar fastened by the same small pearl pin her daughter had chosen that afternoon. Mud covered the hem. Her face was pale and composed, but the skin beneath her jaw bore a thin black line where the embalmer's ribbon had rested. Both arms were raised, her fingers closed around empty air beneath the severed ropes, and when she pulled, the largest bell above the chapel gave a single deep toll. The sound did not come down from the tower. It seemed to rise through the floorboards. Tuck dropped the ring of keys. Rhoda pulled again. The middle bell answered, higher and nearer, and dust trembled from the rafters. On the 3rd pull, Tuck heard other feet outside, not walking across the gravel, but pressing upward through it. The chapel door bowed inward, as though a crowd leaned against the other side. He remembered a warning his mother had given him when he was a boy, one he had not thought of in half a century. If the bells call at midnight, do not tell them who you are. Rhoda turned her head. Her lips did not move, but Tuck heard his surname spoken inside the 3rd toll. He bit down hard enough to taste blood. The minute hand on the wall clock reached 12. All 3 bells sounded together, although nothing in the tower moved. The vestibule door opened an inch. Cold red clay pushed through the gap in 5 narrow ridges, like the tips of buried fingers. At dawn, Reverend Silas Varn found Tuck sitting in the first pew with his boots planted neatly together and his cap in his lap. The chapel was locked from the inside. Rhoda Pell was still in her grave, the earth above her smooth beneath a crust of sleet. Tuck was alive, but he could not speak. Both his palms were blistered in the shape of twisted rope. By 8 o'clock, County Commissioner Darden Kittredge had called it a seizure. By 9, he had called it vandalism. By 10, he had ordered St. Orison's chapel closed and told everyone in Mercy Gap that no bells had rung. Cora Hensley heard the last part while standing behind the counter in the county records room, where rain tapped against the high windows and the fluorescent tubes hummed above shelves of marriage bonds, tax plats, burial permits, and death certificates. Darden had come in wearing a camel-colored overcoat, dotted with sleet. He smelled of wet wool and the peppermints he sucked when he was angry. "You will enter Ramey's condition as an accident on county property," he told her. "I don't enter medical findings," Cora said. "Dr. Cale does." "You type what he sends you." "I type what he signs." Darden removed the peppermint from his mouth and wrapped it in a handkerchief. He had known Cora since she was small enough to hide under the desk where she now worked. He had also known her father, Amos, before the stroke bent the right side of his body and took most of his speech. That familiarity gave his disapproval a patient, almost familial weight. "The chapel is unsound," he said. "A loose beam, a frightened old man, bad weather. The county engineer has recommended demolition since August. This incident proves the point. It proves Tuck was hurt. It proves that building has become dangerous." Beyond the courthouse square, the Smoky Mountains rose in blue-gray folds. Mercy Gap occupied a narrow crease between them, a grocer, a filling station, 2 churches, a funeral home, and houses following the river toward the national forest. St. Orison's stood above it all in Hollow Crown Cemetery, its belfry visible whenever the fog lifted. Cora had played the chapel organ at funerals for 16 years. She knew every warped floorboard, every mouse hole, every pane of amber glass. She also knew the bell ropes had been cut and the clappers removed. She had signed the property inventory herself. "Did you go up there?" she asked. Darden's eyes shifted to the shelf behind her, where the 1974 burial ledger lay open. "I had Deputy Briscoe secure the door." "That wasn't my question." "The chapel is closed, Cora." He placed a folded order on her desk. At the bottom, beneath the county seal, was a date for demolition. November 23rd, 1 week away. Cora read it twice. There are 4 funerals scheduled. They can use First Methodist. 2 of those families are Catholic. Then Reverend Varn can make an arrangement. St. Orison's does not belong to the county. The ground does. The old mission deed reverted when the order dissolved. Cora knew that argument. Darden had used it since summer, when a Knoxville development company offered to buy the ridge below the cemetery for vacation cabins. The chapel stood in the path of the only practical access road. Darden said the sale would bring work. Reverend Varn said the dead had already surrendered enough land. Darden buttoned his coat. "Do not turn this into one of your father's old mountain stories." "My father never told stories." "No," Darden said softly. "He kept them." After he left, Cora closed the burial ledger and drove to Hollow Crown. Cora's station wagon climbed the switchback through sleet. At Hollow Crown, she found Deputy Wade Briscoe smoking beneath the chapel eave. At 29, he had begun to suspect that his uniform did not make people tell him the truth. "Commissioner says nobody goes in," he said. "I have the sacristy inventory." "He says especially you." "That sounds personal." It sounded frightened. Wade flicked his cigarette into the wet grass and unlocked the door. Inside, the chapel retained the sweet, stale odor of funeral flowers. Rhoda Pell's wreaths remained beside the altar, lilies browning at the edges. Tuck's cap was gone, but his keys lay on the floor near the final pew. Cora crouched and saw that the iron ring had sunk into the wood as though it had been hot. The 2 severed bell ropes swayed overhead. There was no draft. Every window was shut. Cora and Wade entered the sacristy. The oak cupboard stood locked. Cora opened it with the inventory key. Inside, the 3 bell clappers lay where they had rested for 21 years, wrapped separately in yellowed altar cloth. The cloth around the largest clapper was wet. Wade touched it, then rubbed his fingers together. Red clay marked his skin. Cora peeled back the linen. The bronze was warm. Around its striking edge, where metal should have been smooth, fresh scratches formed a circle of small, upright letters. Most were too shallow to read. One name had been cut deeply enough to catch the light. ASA Treadwell. From the chapel above them came a slow creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone placing both hands around a rope. Wade drew his revolver before either of them moved. The sound came again, a deliberate twist of hemp against wood. He crossed the chapel, climbed onto a pew, and caught the iron ladder that folded down from the choir loft. Cora followed him upward, carrying the flashlight from the sacristy. The belfry was empty. Its floor lay under decades of pigeon dust and flakes of rust. 3 immense bells hung in a timber frame above them, their mouths black against the roof. None possessed a clapper. The ropes had been severed just below the wheels and coiled on a beam where no one could reach from the chapel. There were no footprints, except Wade's and Cora's. Then the smallest bell turned a fraction of an inch. It did not ring. It merely leaned toward Cora as though listening. Wade holstered his revolver. "Wind. There isn't any. There's always wind up here." He aimed the flashlight at the rafters, unwilling to look at her. Cora examined the rope wheel. A length of newer cord had been tied around one spoke, thin as fishing line. Wade seized it with relief and pulled. The line broke without resistance. Its end was not cut. It had rotted. "Prank," he said, but less firmly. Cora shone the light down through the bell's mouth. At the bottom of the empty bronze chamber, something pale clung to the inner curve. She reached between the wheel supports and removed a square of paper no larger than a postage stamp. It had been pasted there with wax. The paper bore a typed burial number, 350107. The typed number matched permits issued during the 1935 relocation of graves from settlements inside the future park. Mercy Gap's copies remained in courthouse cartons with survey maps and federal receipts. Wade read the number over her shoulder. "Does it mean anything?" "Not yet." They locked the chapel again. Before leaving, Cora stood at the base of the hanging ropes and looked at the place where Rhoda Pell had appeared to tuck. The vestibule floor was clean, except for faint, parallel marks in the wax, 5 on the left and 5 on the right. They led from the door to the aisle and stopped beneath the ropes. At Mercy County Hospital, Tuck lay beside a clanging radiator, while Eunice guarded him. Dr. Cale found no stroke. Tuck understood questions and could write, but no air passed his throat as speech. When Cora showed him the paper from the bell, he turned his face toward the wall. "Tuck," she said, "did you see Asa Treadwell's name?" His shoulders tightened. Eunice leaned close. "Who was Asa?" Tuck reached for the pencil on his tray. His blistered fingers could not close around it, so Cora placed it between his knuckles. He wrote slowly on the back of a meal card. Not a name, a debt. Below that, he drew 3 circles. From each circle, he sketched a line descending into a black square. Cora pointed at the square. "The chapel?" Tuck shook his head. "The cemetery?" Again, he shook his head. Then he jabbed the pencil downward until the lid broke. Under it. The radiator struck once. Tuck flinched so violently that the bed rails rattled. Cora returned to the house beside the shuttered Hensley funeral parlor, which Amos had sold after his stroke. Her 13-year-old daughter, Nell, sat doing algebra under the kitchen lamp. Nell had Cora's brown hair and her late father's habit of listening before entering a room, as though every place possessed a mood that should not be disturbed. "You went to the chapel," Nell said. Cora hung her wet coat near the stove. "Who told you?" "I heard it." "Heard what?" "The low bell. At school, just before lunch." Cora stopped with one hand on the kettle. St. Orison's was 4 miles from the school and separated from it by 2 ridges. Even when the bells had been working, their sound had never carried into town. Probably the firehouse siren test. It said a name. What name? Nell looked toward the hall leading to Amos's room. Ours. A spoon tapped against glass in the bedroom. Cora found her father sitting upright, the blanket pushed away from his knees. Since his stroke 18 months earlier, Amos could say only a few words clearly. Yes. No. Water. Cora. When he became frustrated, he used a child's slate that hung from the side of his chair. Now he had written across it in jagged white letters, "Take Nell away before midnight." Cora knelt beside him. "Did you know Asa Treadwell?" Amos closed his eyes. "I found his name inside a bell." His left hand gripped the armrest. The right remained curled against his chest. "Darden says the chapel will be torn down next Saturday." Amos opened his eyes and made a sound from deep in his throat. It was not a word, but Cora understood the terror in it. He snatched the slate, wiped it with his sleeve, and wrote again. "If stone moves, they all wake." "Who?" He pressed the chalk so hard it snapped. "The ones we did not carry home." At 11:30, Cora put Nell in the station wagon and drove south, intending to take a motel room until she could persuade Darden to delay demolition. She repeated that Amos was frightened by an old memory. Tuck had suffered a seizure, and Nell had mistaken a siren or radio interference for a bell. At 11:46, Amos began striking the brass service bell beside his bed. Cora heard it from the road. The sound came through the car radio after the station dissolved into static. One bright tap, then another, evenly spaced. Nell turned the dial, but the tapping remained. It did not grow softer as the house receded. It seemed to travel inside the dashboard. "Grandpa's calling us," Nell said. Cora swung the wagon around on the wet pavement. They reached home at 11:58. The front door stood open. Amos's wheelchair was empty. 2 narrow tracks crossed the porch, continued through the yard, and entered the abandoned funeral parlor. Cora took a flashlight from the car. Nell followed, despite being ordered to stay. Inside, the old viewing room smelled of dust, mildew, and the chemical sweetness embedded in the walls. Their beam passed over folded casket stands and velvet curtains gone gray with age. At the rear of the preparation room, a trapdoor stood open. Cora had never seen it before. A stairway descended beneath the building. Amos's wheelchair rested at the bottom, overturned. He had dragged himself farther into the dark. In the funeral parlor cellar, they found Amos beside a nailed crate he had opened with a coal shovel. Beneath old ledgers and funeral lamps lay coffin handles, name plates, screws, brass angels, and oval plaques scratched with relocation numbers. Nell picked up a plate. Malaki Rune, 1861 to 1934. Cora saw matching relocation numbers scratched on the backs. 35-111, 35-112, 35-113. Amos dragged the oilcloth aside. Beneath the hardware lay a folded funeral pall made of black wool. White stitching crossed it in crooked lines, forming a map of creeks, ridges, and family plots. At its center, St. Orison's Chapel was represented by 3 small bells. From each bell, black thread descended into a square under the foundation. The clock upstairs began to strike 12. Amos seized Cora's wrist and forced one word through his damaged mouth. Names. The first toll came from the mountain. Every piece of brass in the crate trembled. The second toll shook dust from the cellar joists. Nell dropped the plate, but before it hit the floor, a hand caught it from beneath the open crate. The hand was brown with old earth and cuffed in rotted burial cloth. Cora pulled Nell backward. More fingers appeared between the brass fittings, feeling blindly through them. The crate was only 2 feet deep, yet the arm continued rising beyond any possible shoulder. It held the nameplate toward Amos. He began to weep. The third toll sounded. This one carried no recognizable note. It was crowded with whispers, each voice repeating the same question in a different age and accent. "Who carried us home?" Amos tried to answer. Cora covered his mouth. The fingers released the plate. The arm folded itself downward and vanished between the hardware. For several seconds, the brass continued to quiver. Then all motion stopped. From the direction of Hollow Crown Cemetery came 3 more tolls, slow and immense. Lights appeared one by one in the houses of Mercy Gap. By morning, everyone in town had heard the bells. Darden Kittredge still said they had not rung. At a courthouse meeting on Sunday, an engineer blamed the tolls on contracting bronze and shifting timbers. Darden repeated that fear made patterns out of noise and promised the danger would end when the chapel came down. Cora stood with the brass nameplate hidden in her handbag. "What is beneath the chapel?" "Stone," Darden said. "My father remembers the cemetery relocations." The older residents lowered their eyes. Those born after the park was created looked toward parents and grandparents who had never spoken about the clearances or the family plots swallowed by forest. Reverend Silas Varn rose. St. Orison's had passed among denominations after the Catholic order that built it dissolved, and he had become its keeper because no one else wanted the responsibility. "The original plan shows a sealed cistern under the foundation," he said. "You told me it was filled," Darden replied. "I told you it was listed as filled." "A record is not the same as a fact," Cora said. Afterward, Wade Briscoe met Cora in the courthouse basement. He had borrowed the key from the janitor and brought 2 flashlights, a thermos, and the expression of a man preparing to regret an act of conscience. The relocation files occupied 6 shelves behind furnace pipes. Dust lay so thick on the cartons that their fingers left tracks. Permit 35117 belonged to Asa Treadwell. The form identified him as a laborer, age 42, unmarried, deceased, November 18, 1935. Cause of death: accidental fall. Original place of burial: Rattler's Branch family ground. New place of burial: Hollow Crown. Plot C-19. The relocation had been certified by Caleb Hensley, undertaker, Reverend Ephraim Vale, witness, and Abel Kittredge, county magistrate. Cora stared at her grandfather's signature. Wade found the corresponding cemetery map. Plot C-19 did not exist. Section C ended at Grave 18, where a retaining wall met the chapel's eastern foundation. "Maybe they changed the numbering," he said. They didn't. Every plate matched a permit assigned to a non-existent or occupied plot. Though the forms covered 8 months, the same damaged typewriter and the same disguised hand appeared throughout. Cora listed 15 names, including 2 infants, identified only as Baby Bell and Infant Sorrel, then added Asa Treadwell. Cora made a list of names: Malachi Roon, Esther Roon, Boyd Sorrell, Lita Sorrell, Thomas Vale, Ora Finch, Hiram and Maud Bell. 2 infants named only as Baby Bell and Infant Sorrel. 15 in all, plus Asa Treadwell. Wade opened a narrow ledger marked Federal Reimbursements. Beside each name was a payment for a separate coffin, wagon transport, labor, and reinterment service. On the final page, a memorandum recorded the purchase of 3 new bell clappers for St. Orison's, cast by the Ashwell Foundry in Knoxville. Materials supplied locally, recovered funeral brass. Cora felt cold despite the furnace. "They melted the coffin fittings," she said. Wade read the line again. "That doesn't prove bodies weren't moved." "No, the false plots prove that." No confession explained the fraud. The files showed only 16 people certified as buried, where no graves existed. Federal money entering Caleb Hensley's and Abel Kittredge's accounts, and 3 clappers cast from funeral brass. A week later, Asa Treadwell supposedly fell from the tower. At dusk, Cora and Silas followed the stitched map to Rattler's Branch. Beyond a chained park gate, abandoned chimneys protruded from blackberry thickets, and a rusted bed frame leaned against a tree. The family ground occupied a shelf above the creek. 15 empty grave depressions remained where fieldstone markers had been removed. The family ground occupied a shelf above the creek. Its fieldstone markers had been removed, leaving pale sockets in the moss. 15 long depressions showed where graves had once lain. All were empty. Silas knelt and pressed his fingers into one depression. They were taken, but not to Hollow Crown. Near the edge of the plot, Cora found wagon ruts preserved beneath a fallen slab of shale. They led downhill toward an overgrown logging track that once connected directly with Mercy Gap. The dead had traveled that road. They had reached the chapel or come close to it. The preserved wagon ruts led toward Mercy Gap. During the November 1935 storm, the chapel had served as a shelter while bridges washed out. Caleb could have stored the bodies there, then buried empty coffins for the inspector and left the remains hidden when the road reopened. Silas walked to the far corner of the graveyard. A small marker remained beneath a rhododendron. too low and plain to have attracted the relocation crew. Its inscription had nearly vanished. "Wait here, and I will call you by name." "Not scripture," he said. Cora brushed away moss. Beneath the words was a crude carving of 3 bells connected by lines to a square. The same design appeared on the pall, a branch cracked uphill. They turned. A woman stood among the trees in a dark rain cape, holding a kerosene lantern. She was thin, white-haired, and older than anyone who should have walked that far without help. Cora recognized Iva Treadwell, who had delivered half the children in Mercy Gap before the hospital opened. "You took your time," Iva said. She led them to a one-room cabin outside the former settlement boundary. It had no electricity. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and newspapers insulated the walls. On a table beside the stove sat 16 small jars, each containing a coil of black thread. "Asa was my mother's brother," Eva said. He kept the chapel grounds and helped move the mountain graves. He could read, which made Caleb Hensley useful to him. Caleb had him copy names and numbers. When Asa learned the coffins were being reused for photographs, he threatened to go to Knoxville. "Why didn't he?" Cora asked. "He tried." Eva poured coffee into chipped cups. The storm washed out the bridge. The inspector arrived early and stayed at the hotel in town. Abel Kittredge told Asa there would be no payment unless the work appeared finished. Families had already left. Nobody remained to ask where their dead had gone. "What happened at the chapel?" Iva looked at the stove. "The sisters built a warning line from the cistern to all 3 bells," Iva said. Asa found the relocated bodies stacked below in quilts and canvas. He went down to count them. Caleb and Abel barred the hatch so he could not reach the federal inspector. "Why?" "To keep him until the inspector left." That was what Caleb later claimed. Silas's face tightened. Later, the storm filled the cistern through an old spring channel. Asa pulled the warning line at midnight. Abel feared the inspector would follow the sound, so he and Caleb climbed the tower and cut the ropes. Cora saw the frayed lengths hanging above the chapel aisle. Everyone believed they had been cut in 1952 when the belfry cracked. "They let him drown," she said. "They let all of them remain where no one would find them." Iva opened a tin box and removed a strip of linen covered in faded writing. It was not a prayer. It was a pledge, signed by Caleb Hensley, Abel Kittredge, and Ephraim Vale. "We swear one name, one grave, one toll, and the road home before winter." They made the promise to the families, Iva said. Isa made them repeat it over the coffins. Mountain people did not trust county men, and they trusted undertakers even less. The pledge was meant to bind the work. Silas read the final line, written in another hand. "May those denied a name borrow the hands of those who denied it." Cora looked up. "Who wrote that?" "Asa's mother after the bells rang." That sounds like a curse. It was grief. Grief becomes many things when men hide it under stone. Cora asked why the bells had been silent for so long. The bells rang whenever a false burial entered the ledger or one of the 3 families disturbed the foundation, Eva said. Caleb heard them before death. Reverend Vale heard them and fled. Abel removed the clappers, but metal was never the cause. Why now? Because Darden means to break the threshold stone. The room seemed to contract around them. Iva wound black thread around one finger. "The dead below cannot climb until the foundation opens, but they can borrow those buried on consecrated ground. The first toll raises the newly dead. The second leads them to the ropes. The third calls the oathbreaker's blood. A descendant who answers loses the use of his hands until every denied person receives a toll." "How many tolls?" Silas asked. 16. Cora thought of Tuck's ruined palms. He wasn't a descendant. No, he kept silent. They tried to use him and failed. What stops them? The promise completed exactly as it was broken. One true name. One honest grave. One willing toll for each of the dead. We have 15 names and asas. Eva did not answer. Cora understood. There are more. Iva placed a 17th jar on the table. Its thread was white. When the bodies were counted, she said, Asa found 16 from the family ground. The permits list 15. One name was removed before the forms were typed. No plate remains. No family stayed to remember it. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches with a dry, collective murmur. What happens if we miss one? Cora asked. At midnight, after the stone is broken, every grave in Hollow Crown will open. The dead will ring until a living voice gives the missing name. If no one can, they will keep borrowing hands. Silas folded the pledge. Then we find the name. Eva stared at Cora with tired pity. Your father already knows it. Amos refused to write the missing name while Nell was in the room. He sat at the kitchen table with the black funeral pall spread before him. Rain clicked against the windows. Cora placed the brass plates in rows and read each name aloud. At everyone, her father nodded. When she reached the empty place represented by white thread, he stared at his useless right hand. You told me she left, he said at last. The sentence emerged, broken and breathless, but it was the longest he had spoken since the stroke. Who left? Cora asked. My mother. Cora had grown up with a single photograph of her grandmother, a young woman standing beside the funeral parlor in a white summer dress. Amos had been told she abandoned the family when he was 6. Caleb Hensley never remarried and accepted the town's sympathy with grave dignity. No death certificate existed under her married name. Amos pulled the slate close and wrote, Eleanor Ruth Hensley, born Rune. He paused until his breathing steadied. She went home, he whispered. Eleanor had left Caleb in 1933 after years of quiet cruelty and moved back to the Rune cabin at Rattler's Branch. When pneumonia killed her the following winter, her brothers buried her beside their parents, beneath a field stone, marked only with a carved lily. Caleb did not attend. He told Amos she had gone north with another man. During the relocation, Caleb recognized her by the silver wedding band still on one finger. He removed the band, erased her name from Asa's list, and claimed there were only 15 bodies. The ring went into the box of funeral brass. Its metal became part of the largest clapper. Amos had been 7 years old. His father made him sit in the chapel choir loft while the empty coffins were displayed for the inspector. From above, the boy saw Eleanor's hand protruding from a wagon canvas in the aisle. He recognized a crescent-shaped scar on her thumb. He called to her. Caleb dragged him into the sacristy and held a hand over his mouth until he nearly fainted. That night, Amos saw Eleanor carried below and the cistern barred. When Isa rang the warning bells, Caleb forced the 7-year-old boy into the tower and ordered him to cut the line. Amos obeyed because his father said the living would lose everything for bodies that felt nothing. The bell stopped after the 3rd cut. For the rest of his life, Amos heard them whenever rain struck a roof after midnight. Cora pressed both hands against the table. Her father's silence no longer seemed like cowardice alone. It had been built for him, year after year, from a child's obedience and a grown man's shame. Yet he had kept the brass, hidden the pall, and allowed the chapel ledger to remain false. You knew Darden meant to tear it down. Amos bowed his head. You knew what was under there. A tear descended into the crease beside his mouth. Nell entered from the hall. She had heard enough. She placed her hand over Amos's curled fist, not forgiving him, not withdrawing from him. We have the name now, she said. Cora filed for an emergency injunction. Darden rejected it. Silas called church and state offices, and Wade copied the permits for investigators. Every remedy required time. At 3 o'clock, a demolition crew appeared on the ridge 2 days early. At 3 o'clock, Preston Hale's demolition crew arrived at Hollow Crown 2 days ahead of schedule. Cora saw the backhoe from the courthouse window. Its yellow arm moved along the ridge behind the bare trees. She called Wade, then Silas, then home. The telephone rang unanswered beside Amos's chair. By the time she reached the cemetery, the chapel yard had been fenced with orange flags. Darden stood beside the backhoe in a hard hat and overcoat. Hale argued with him near the eastern wall, where workers had uncovered a broad threshold slab extending beyond the foundation. "There's a void under it," Hale said. "Could be a spring chamber. We need shoring." "You were hired to remove a chapel, not conduct an excavation. I'm not putting a machine over a hollow." Darden saw Cora climbing the path. "You are trespassing on a closed site. There are human remains under that floor. You have no evidence admissible in any court. I have 17 names." For the first time, his control faltered. Cora took Eleanor's plate substitute from her coat pocket, a strip of clean brass on which Nell had stamped the name using tools from the funeral home. Darden looked at it as though it were a weapon. "My father was a boy," Cora said. "He saw what Caleb and Abel did." Darden moved close enough that only she could hear him. "Your father saw a county survive. Those payments kept 6 families from starving. The inspector would have frozen every account. Roads would not have been rebuilt. The dead were already dead. Then why are you afraid of them?" His face hardened. "I am afraid of what frightened people do to the living." He ordered Hale to leave the machine and dismiss the crew. Publicly, he announced a 24-hour postponement. Privately, Wade learned that Darden had borrowed a smaller track loader from a road contractor in Newport. It would reach the cemetery after dark. Cora, Silas, Wade, Nell, and Amos spent the evening preparing 17 graves. They opened 17 narrow resting trenches around the chapel. Tuck Ramey came from the hospital with bandaged hands and carried cedar stakes marked with the recovered names. Other families brought shovels, lanterns, blankets, and the stubborn silence of people who had decided not to be ordered home. No one rang the bells. Silas and Wade used the chapel's old block and tackle to raise the largest clapper into the tower. It took 6 men and nearly 2 hours. When the bronze tongue settled inside the bell, it turned of its own weight until one scarred edge faced Cora. In the metal, she saw a pale seam like a wedding band, melted but not erased. At 10:30, the crowd heard an engine below the ridge. Darden's track loader came through the lower cemetery gate without lights. He drove it himself. Instead of approaching from the road, he climbed the unfinished cabin access cut and struck the chapel's eastern foundation from below. The threshold slab split. A sound like a deep breath passed under the cemetery. Every lantern flame leaned toward the chapel. The earth over Rhoda Pell's grave lifted by an inch and settled. Then it lifted again. Darden reversed the loader. The ground collapsed beneath its left tread. The machine tilted against the chapel wall, and the bucket crashed through the masonry. Behind the broken stones appeared a black cavity crossed by an old iron pipe. Water poured out. It was not clear spring water. It carried scraps of quilt, splinters of coffin wood, and thousands of small white roots that writhed when they reached the air. The smell that followed was mineral, cold and ancient, with beneath it the sweet trace of funeral chemicals. The first grave opened. Rhoda Pell rose through the sleet-crusted earth without using her hands. Soil slid from her gray dress. Her eyes remained closed. She walked toward St. Orison's with her arms extended, fingers closing around an invisible rope. Graves broke across the hillside. The dead emerged in burial clothes spanning 40 years. Suits, flowered dresses, a military uniform, a child's red coat. They ignored the living and walked toward the chapel with arms raised for ropes. People fled down the ridge. Some remained beside graves they recognized, unable to follow or turn away. Cora took Nell by the shoulders. "Go with Mrs. Ramey. I can read the names. Go." Nell looked at Amos. His chair stood empty beside the open chapel door. He had dragged himself inside. At 11:52, the first of the risen dead entered St. Orison's. Rhoda Pell took her place beneath the largest severed rope. 2 men dead since the 1950s stood beneath the others. More crowded the aisle, shoulder to shoulder, until the chapel resembled a congregation assembled for a service no living minister had authorized. Silas carried the cedar stakes to the altar. Wade climbed the belfry ladder to release the restored rope. Cora found Amos at the broken threshold, staring into the flooded cistern. Lantern light revealed the dead beneath the chapel. They had not decayed into separate bones. Mineral water had clothed them in a pale crust, joining quilt cloth, ribs, buttons, and hair into a single recumbent mass. 16 forms lay side by side along the stone floor. A 17th sat against the wall beneath the severed emergency line. Its hand still enclosed the rope. Asa Treadwell. Around his wrist, black thread had been knotted 16 times. Amos reached toward the opening. "Mother." One of the mineral-coated faces turned. Cora pulled him back as the chapel clock began striking the quarter hour. The sound awakened movement throughout the cistern. Fingers loosened from cloth. Heads tilted toward the bells. Water climbed the wall against gravity and entered the iron pipe leading upward. Silas opened the burial ledger on the altar. "We name them. We bring the remains out. And we ring once for each." "There isn't time to carry them," Wade called from the loft. "Then we name them first." The chapel doors slammed. Darden stood inside the vestibule with a pistol. Mud covered his overcoat, and blood ran from a cut above one eyebrow. Behind him, the risen dead blocked every exit. "No one opens that chamber," he said. "It is open," Cora answered. "We seal it. We pour concrete before morning." Silas stepped away from the altar. "Your grandfather tried stone. My grandfather preserved this town. He preserved his name." Darden aimed the pistol at the ledger. "Burn it." At 11:59, all 3 bells shifted in their frames. The dead raised their hands. Darden heard what Cora had heard only as metal and thunder before. His face emptied. The smallest bell spoke the first syllable of his surname. The middle bell completed it. "Kittredge," he answered without meaning to. "I am Darden Kittredge." The pistol fell from his hand. Rhoda Pell's fingers closed around the restored rope, though it still hung several feet above her. The rope lengthened like wet hair. It wrapped once around Darden's wrists. The other dead seized it, and when the clock reached midnight, they pulled. The largest bell gave a toll that shook glass from the windows. Darden's arms rose above his head. He tried to plant his feet, but the rope drew him down the aisle. The dead passed it from hand to hand until he stood beneath the tower, his body bent in the posture of a bell ringer. Each time they pulled, his hands moved with theirs. The second toll opened the cistern completely. The threshold slab lifted and turned aside. Water spread across the chapel floor without flowing out the doors. In its surface appeared reflections of people who were not present. Mountain families beside empty graves, women watching wagons depart, children holding flowers for coffins that carried no one. Cora took the first cedar stake. "Malachi Rune," she said. Silas repeated the name and entered it in the open ledger. Cora placed the stake into the water. A mineral-coated figure in the cistern exhaled a thread of white mist. Wade released the bell rope from the loft, and Cora caught it. The dead tried to pull through her. Pain burned across her palms. She wrapped the rope around her forearms and forced it downward by her own strength. "One honest toll," she said. The bell rang. Malachi Roon's body separated from the mass below. The water lowered around him, leaving his bones wrapped in a recognizable quilt. Men waiting outside the broken wall lifted him carefully into the first trench. Cora named Esther Roon, then Boyd Sorrell, Leda Sorrell, Thomas Vale, Ora Finch, Hiram Bell, Maud Bell. The unnamed infants were entered as the families had once called them in private: Little Joseph Bell and May Sorrell, names recovered from Iva's memory and a stitched corner of the pall. Each name required a toll. Each toll drove the rope deeper into Cora's skin. The risen dead pulled against Cora, not to stop her, but to claim the toll. With each true name, however, one released the rope and sank gently to the floor before returning to its grave outside. Darden remained beneath the tower, jerking with every bell. He shouted that the names were lies, that no promise made to the dead could bind the living, that Mercy Gap owed its survival to men willing to choose necessity over superstition. The bell swallowed his words. At the 15th name, the smallest bell split along its rim. At the 16th, Silas called Asa Treadwell. The seated figure in the cistern opened its eyes. They were not eyes of flesh, but two clear hollows in the mineral mask through which lantern light passed. Asa released the emergency rope. It slithered from the pipe and fell across the chapel floor, stopping at Amos's knees. Amos took it with his left hand. "I cut it," he said. "I heard you. I cut it." Asa's head inclined. Amos pulled once. The cracked, smallest bell answered with a thin, pure note. His chair rolled backward from the force, but the rope did not burn him. When the sound faded, Asa's body collapsed into ordinary bones and black thread. Only one figure remained joined to the stone. Eleanor Hensley lay beneath the largest bell. The mineral crust around her left hand had broken away, revealing a crescent scar on the thumb. Cora lifted the final brass strip. Darden began laughing. "You cannot name her," he gasped. "Not with that name." She left him. She rejected the family. The pledge covered the mountain dead, not a runaway wife. Amos turned toward him. "She was carried with them. Your father removed her." "My father lied." The bells drew breath. Cora read the stamped words: Eleanor Ruth Hensley, born Roon. Nothing happened. The dead tightened their hold on the ropes. Every face in the chapel turned toward Cora. From the tower came her own surname, spoken in a voice like bronze dragged across stone. Hensley. She understood the final demand. Caleb had not merely denied Eleanor a grave. He had denied that she belonged to him, then preserved his own honor through her disappearance. A Hensley had to answer willingly, not in defense, not by accident, but as witness. Cora gave the rope to Nell, who had returned, and stood beside the altar with tears frozen on her cheeks. Then Cora faced the tower. "My name is Cora Eleanor Hensley," she said. "I am her granddaughter. I carry the name of the man who abandoned her and the woman he erased." The ropes descended. The ropes closed around Cora's hands. Through the dead she saw 1935, empty display coffins, Eleanor under canvas, Asa pounding the hatch, and Caleb restraining a terrified boy while bells thundered over the storm. She felt each choice called necessary after it became unforgivable. The dead borrowed her hands. Cora seized the rope before they could seize it for her. She pulled. The final toll shattered every window. The bell swung, and the pale seam in its clapper flashed like a restored ring. Water lifted Eleanor from the cistern. For one moment she stood before Amos young and free of clay, touched his damaged cheek, and was released. She touched his damaged cheek. Then the water released her. The risen dead let go of the ropes. One by one, they turned and walked out of the chapel toward their open graves. Families followed at a distance, carrying lanterns. No corpse looked back. Darden alone continued ringing. The rope had wound around both arms and drawn him upward until his feet no longer touched the floor. He begged Cora to give him another name, any name, a false one if necessary. She tried to reach him, but the bell swung harder. The belfry timbers cracked. Bronze filled the chapel with a final violent roar. The rope snapped. Darden vanished into the darkness above. When Wade climbed the ladder minutes later, the tower was empty. The roof hatch remained bolted. On the edge of the clapper, fused into the bronze, he found Darden's gold wedding band. Cora opened her mouth to call for Nell. No sound emerged. By dawn, 17 sets of remains rested in cedar-lined trenches beneath true names. Silas read the old pledge, the names, and the payment attached to each false grave. At Amos's request, Caleb received no prayer. Cora's voice did not return. Dr. Cale found no injury to her throat. Specialists in Knoxville found none either. She could breathe, swallow, and form words with her mouth, but every attempt produced only a faint metallic vibration that made nearby glass tremble. She learned to carry a notebook. Nell learned to wait while her mother wrote. Amos lived until spring and dictated by slate everything he remembered. Wade sent the statement and false permits to the state attorney general. Investigators confirmed the fraud, but never found Darden Kittredge. His loader, pistol, and ring fused to the bell were entered into evidence. St. Orison's remained standing, its twisted tower too fragile for the largest bell to be removed. The ridge passed to a memorial trust. Behind an iron grate, the open cistern showed the old emergency pipe, and Nell painted the 17 names on the wall. Tuck Ramey regained his speech after Eleanor's burial. He never described what Rhoda Pell had looked like beneath the ropes. He said only that the dead had not come to punish the town. They had come because no one living had finished carrying them. Cora returned to the organ the next autumn, with Nell turning pages and singing. No funeral continued after sunset. At each burial, the full name was read at the threshold and checked twice against ledger and marker. People called it respect. Older residents knew it was also fear. The custom spread beyond Mercy Gap. People said it was respect. Older residents knew it was also fear. Years later, visitors called it the Cursed Chapel, where the dead rang the bells at midnight. They added phantom nuns and a bell that predicted death, forgetting the receipts, stolen brass, and men who believed a false record could make an empty grave true. They rarely mentioned Cora, because a silent survivor fit the legend less neatly than a vanished commissioner. But each November 18th, she climbed the ridge before dark and stood beneath the tower with Nell. At midnight, the bells remained still. No rope moved, no grave opened. Only the largest bell gave off a low vibration too soft for the ear. Cora felt it through the floorboards and placed her scarred palms against the wood. Beneath them, the chapel seemed to hold one long, sleeping breath. Then frost appeared across the empty cistern, spreading in 17 narrow lines until each line touched a painted name. The final mark always formed beneath Eleanor's. It resembled the print of a hand with a crescent scar on the thumb, resting not against the stone, but on the other side of it.